Thank you for joining us. I'm Yolanda Gill. I'm a Director of Knowledge Technologies, and I'm also a research professor in computer science. I work at the Information Sciences Institute at the University of Southern California. My background is in artificial intelligence. I've been working on semantics, intelligent user interfaces, and knowledge-rich environments for many years now, and got interested in how those topics are relevant to scientists and scientific research about a decade ago. So I'm going to talk today about software, actually. We're very interested in capturing software from scientists and describing it so that it can be discovered and reused. We have a project called OntoSoft that is part of the EarthCube initiative from NSF. So I'll be covering the work that we're doing under that project. The title of the talk is Software Matters, both meanings of the word. The scientific software that scientists develop really matters, and we want to rescue it. And we also want to convey to them that it matters that you share your software. So let me get started with this cartoon that I think shows pretty accurately what happens in a scientist's lab. So the professor will say, you know, to a student, you have to do this project, and don't worry, you don't have to start the code from scratch. There was somebody else a few years ago that developed the code that you need as a basis for your work, and of course there's no instructions, no comments, there's no idea where the files are or what's needed to run it, and you know, it's usually a painful process. This is from PhD Comics. I'm sure it's a site that we all visit often. And so the poor student goes there and tries to find all this code. There's a deadline, finds a huge mess, and you know, kind of goes through a lot of pain to do this work, and then finally they're done and they don't worry about how to leave the code in a good state for the next person. So this is pretty typical, you know, even in computer science circles, I would imagine, because my research group, of course, does not work this way. So in this context, we have to think about these practices of science in the context of how things are changing. So more and more, there's an emphasis from publishers to make publications more transparent, more reproducible, to make the software available that was used to do any kind of computational research. There's also changes from the funding and policy side. So you all know that NSF just released in March a report on their plans to make research products available. And this is in response to a mandate from the government, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, to get all the research agencies that fund research with federal funds to have a plan in place to make those research products shared and open. So NSF is just an example here, but this is happening from all the agencies. And then we're all getting used to having open source, openly shared data, software. We're used to collaboration. We're used to crowdsourcing. We're also seeing a lot of very successful citizen science projects where we know that the citizens that participate in these projects are not just following instructions, but they're actually taking the initiative on their own and making discoveries and publishing papers in scientific journals that make contributions to science. So opening science has these benefits of opening participation. So science is changing. I think also scientists are changing. This is from a survey by Nature a few years ago where they asked scientists to think about the things they would like to be most recognized for as a contribution. And the whole list is on the right-hand side, and I'm highlighting here the top-ranked items. So one of the top-ranked items, very close to teaching, collaborations, and publications, is the development of research resources, and that includes software. And way down the list, you can see it on the right, way down is data deposited in public repositories. So we all hear and know that data is very important and data sets really matter, but I think scientists are much more proud of the software that they develop if you look at this survey. Another reason to share software is because it enhances the reproducibility of the work. So there's a lot of articles that present studies where if the data is not made available, it's very hard to replicate the work, but there's also an emphasis on the availability of the software in order to be able to replicate the work. So here's a few highlights from, a very recent New York Times article, I think a month ago, on retracting scientific studies, which is becoming a problem. Even some years ago, I think 2010, a Nobel laureate retracted 2 studies. Replications is a big problem. You can see this pie chart in the middle. Bayer Pharmaceuticals tried to replicate results of a lot of studies in biomedical research for the purpose of developing possible drugs, and they couldn't replicate most of the studies. So, and they have a lot of resources and money and the drive to do the replication. Imagine when somebody in a lab is trying to replicate somebody else's work. So this is a big problem. And Steve Colbert had actually a student who failed to replicate a study from Harvard professors, and actually the professors made a mistake in their paper. So if you want to watch that segment of the show, he really had a good time with that, as you can imagine. So there's been work on reproducible publications and executable papers. I think the earliest that I know is from the group that John Claerbout run at Stanford. He's a geophysicist, emeritus now, but he had all the work in his group be documented with the code, the specific parameters and settings, so that everybody could run any prior results that they had done in the lab. More recently, there was a widely used package called Sweave that enables people to include R code in LaTeX, and also IPy Notebook is something that many people use today to keep track of code and notes about the code and the research in the same document. And those 2 journals have articles with many examples of this trend to include code with papers. So code is very important. It's also the case that it's hard to tell what somebody does in their research if you don't have the code available. So I show this as an example. We tried to replicate the work that was done to discover drugs in this particular paper that was published some years ago. And what we found is that if you really go through the different steps of the method that's described in the paper, and that's the kind of the squares on the right-hand side, there's 3 main parts to the method. If you have minimal knowledge about this particular area of research, if you're just in general a biologist but you don't know a whole lot about this area, you can only reproduce some pieces of the method, and you can see them in green. So there's significant pieces in red if you have minimal knowledge. But if you're a novice in that domain, you still have trouble replicating the second and the third part of the method. And actually, we found that you had to be the author in order to replicate most of the method. So you really have to have very, very deep knowledge in a particular area to be able to figure out what they did in the work. And this really hampers collaboration and experimentation across disciplines and even across research areas in the same discipline. So this is a big problem. Today, the problems that we're working on, and in particular the OntoSoft project that I mentioned, is focused on geosciences. And what you see is that you really want to improve the way that software is shared. So when scientists develop big models, so say a big climate model, that code is really valued, it is shared, it's considered a resource. And the code really embodies very sophisticated knowledge about those models and is very valuable. But there's also a lot of other software that implements things like data reformatting or quality control or visualization, plotting, and these data pre-processing steps are estimated to take between 60 and 80% of effort in most research projects. I'll show you more detail on this in a second. But this is code that is usually not deposited anywhere and not shared. So while we see repositories of software that has to do with big models, so CSDMS is a great repository for surface dynamics and other earth science models. There's others like CIG, SMF in Geosciences. There's really no shared repository for other kinds of geosciences software. So there's always GitHub and these very general purpose software repositories. But if you're a geoscientist and you had to find a model for a particular purpose, it would be hard to find it, and much more if it's one of these data pre-processing software. So I mentioned 60 to 80% of the effort in a project goes to data pre-processing. This is something that resonates with audiences where I give this talk. If they're on the commercial side, they say this is, really underestimated. But there's a quote there from a NASA announcement where they made this claim. We've also corroborated this through an analysis of workflows from different workflow systems in different domains. You can see the variety from astrophysics to biodiversity to genomics, geoinformatics, text mining. So you can see that the data pre-processing steps are really taking a vast majority of the steps in these workflows. So we think that there's good evidence that this kind of software is very important to preserve. And it's typically not. So we call it dark software. So these are, for example, codes that have models that are never published. So, for example, for a thesis, the data preparation software that I mentioned, and also visualization software. So even if a model is often shared, different ways to project and visualize that software may not be. So this dark software is a play on words on the dark data that Bruce Heidorn talked about in terms of how a lot of data is shared, but actually there's many, a very long tail of investigators that don't share their data, and it remains dark data as far as the community is concerned. So we're concerned with this dark software. In terms of how other scientists and why would they care about the software that is dark and is not published, we see this happen a lot. So I'm quoting here from a report from the NSF EarthCube initiative on a workflow roadmap for the geosciences, and Marlon was one of the co-authors. And we heard these quotes from scientists that responded to our surveys. So I need to reformat my data to run this model, and I need to learn to do that. I know someone that has done this data cleaning before. I wish I had their code. I'm not a programmer. This is going to take months. It's just data preparation, and I'm not even sure that I'll do it right. I wonder what visualization would be good to use, and I wrote a ton of code. I don't want it to go to waste. How could it pass on? I hear a lot of stories like this. Last this Monday, I was at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and a student came to me and said, I'm so glad to hear that code matters, because I actually wrote some code and it's taking off, and I have hundreds of users, and I would like to have a way to publish it more formally and manage the user base, and I don't know what to do. So I think there's a lot of reasons why the software that scientists use is very valuable. Here's another very common situation, which is that a scientist will teach themselves how to run a particular a particular language, and they can run code in that language. So, for example, if they're used to using R, that's the kind of code that they can run. Here I have an example, which is actually a real-world example, where the senior researcher in the lab had been writing Fortran for years, and the students were not very conversant in Fortran. They've had a really hard time running their advisor's code, and then each of the students had taught themselves Java and Perl respectively, and they would like to reuse each other's code, but they found the barrier of using another language very difficult. So probably within the same lab there's this heterogeneity, so it's useful to try to share the software as much as possible so that we have alternative implementations and a better way, a better handle on how to run software in other languages. We hear also a lot of different reasons why software is not shared. I think you can read through them, but the most common one seems to be, I don't know where to start, and my code is not very good, or things like that. We always point them to an article that is actually called "Your Software is Good Enough," and they seem to like that. They seem to be more confident about that. But there's really a lot of lack of knowledge about how to share software. So in this context, the NSF launched the EarthCube initiative about 4 years ago. I use this slide because this is one of the early slides on EarthCubes where they really emphasize the transformation of practices in doing science, trying to improve the productivity, accelerating research, and providing a knowledge management framework for the geosciences. So EarthCube aims to promote the sharing of the kinds of science research products that we're talking about here, such as software and others. So within the context of EarthCube, we're working on a project called OntoSoft on software stewardship for geosciences. And we want to help improve the understanding of the software that others develop so that scientists can reuse it. If we're able to accomplish this, it can really have an impact in terms of the goals of EarthCube. So multiplying productivity because scientists can reuse the software from others, increase accessibility of software to researchers that are not programmers or researchers that are in other disciplines and wouldn't otherwise have access to those to that software. We can improve reproducibility and also the quality of the research, and we can help new researchers come up to speed in whatever area they are undertaking. So our view on software stewardship is a multidisciplinary one. So we have a team, so I'm showing you here the PIs of the team. So we include geoscientists that, of course, understand requirements better than we do, geoinformatics experts that understand modeling software and the lessons learned from decades now of sharing model software and model codes, computer scientists that understand metadata, software engineers that understand software reuse, and then also social sciences, because you really have to understand online communities and what it means for a community to really work together to share knowledge, or in this case, software. So our project has three major aspects. One is this emphasis on a community. So we want to be able to not just have a scientist go and search for certain keywords and what kind of software they would like to use, but we want to have a way to recommend software based on the software that they have uploaded. We want them to have connections to others that work in similar problems and tell them, people that downloaded your software also downloaded X. Or people that downloaded your software were interested in this other similar software that is, different from yours. So the community aspect of it is important to us. On the bottom left, you see publication. That's another area that we've been working on. So giving interactive advice and guiding a scientist to publish their software and describe it appropriately for others to use. And then finally, and very importantly, being able to disseminate best practices. This is a challenge because developing software is not the top level priority of scientists. So we're very concerned about how can we best help them learn best practices of software sharing. So the project is soon to be ending its first year, so we've basically just started, but we focus mostly on the bottom two aspects of this. So this interactive advice to publish software, and also disseminating best practices, and I'll talk more about those in the rest of the talk. We have a variety of collaborators. You may be familiar with some of these. The UK has a software institute that has done phenomenal work. They also include cyber infrastructure software. That's something that we don't cover. We're very much focused on scientists, what they need, what they require for reusing other scientists' software. We don't focus on cyber infrastructure software. There's another important piece, which is an early career advisory board. So we formed an advisory board of about 30 people in different areas of geosciences that were either young professors or postdocs or grad students, and really trying to understand what they would need to do a better job with software sharing, and they've been instrumental for the project. Our driving scenarios, and this is part of the project, come from the critical zone observatories. So this is just an example where we're illustrating how software matters in this particular project. They were trying to understand how a landscape goes from being initially uniform to over hundreds and hundreds of years becoming this network of rivers, as you can see on the top right. But I think the gist of the story is that the scientists actually go through a simple model. Maybe they write it in MATLAB, then they try to scale it up, they reuse some other software, they need to run some differential equations, they use commercial software, they write some scripts. All of these processes can really be helped through this kind of software commons for geosciences that OntoSoft aims to provide. Other requirements come from what's called the EarthCube Research Coordination Network. So these are groups of scientists in particular areas. So I just mentioned three of them here. So the Sediment Experimentalist Network, so these are geologists that basically have a fish tank in their lab, and they move it and shake it and see what happens to the different sediments and so on. That's essentially how I understand it. So they want to share their software to promote comparability of their results, since they have this more contained environment that they do their experiments in. They should be able to really reproduce and compare their results. EC3 is a field science network, and they're very interested in comparing and understanding the capabilities of different mobile apps that they can take in the field and collect information about samples and the locations. And then finally, C4P. So paleogeoscientists, we've been working with them, as you'll see in a minute. They've actually worked together to compile all the software that is popular and commonly used in the community, and they needed help structuring their descriptions and so on. From our early career advisory committee, we got a lot of interesting feedback about their priorities, and one of the things that we learned is that we thought they would be concerned with learning to do better software development and to improve their software development skills and have a better understanding of version control and other kinds of software engineering technologies. It turns out that was not a high priority for them. So they thought it would be nice. It's one of those things that can be always in your list, nice to learn, but that was not their biggest priority. Their biggest priority were more about, how do I need to go about sharing my software? How do I get credit for my software? How do I manage contributors to the software? So more to do with the social aspects of software sharing and the practicalities of open source software repositories and so on. So general use cases that we got from them, I think I mentioned a lot of these things, but they'd like to find particular models. They want to know if they put their code on GitHub, what else is useful for them to do so people find it. How do they advertise that their code exists? If they find a model, how do they visualize the results? Who has maybe software that would be useful to visualize the results, tracking and getting credit for uses of the software. And then sometimes they have simple scripts that they know might be useful, but they don't know how to go about making it available. So let me focus first on helping with the publication of software, and then I'll talk about learning, and then I'll wrap up the talk. So in terms of the publication of software, we're concerned with helping the scientists provide structured metadata, so really describe their software appropriately, and then providing interactive advice to do the publication of the software. So an early prototype that we did was really geared towards organizing different categories of software, putting a new piece of software in perspective of others that existed, collecting a lot of different kinds of metadata. And this was nice, but it was more thinking about how we computer scientists want to understand the code and manage it and maybe compose it with others and organize it into categories. This was not exactly what they wanted. So we kind of took a step back and thought very hard about what did scientists want to talk about in terms of describing their software. And this led us to develop an ontology for describing scientific software metadata. And it's the OntoSoft ontology. It's available. I'll have pointers at the end of the talk to it. But essentially, it's intended to describe the software that scientists develop, and it's intended to be organized so that a scientist would understand all these different metadata categories. The major categories of metadata are listed here: identifying the software, understanding what it does, running it, get support if you have questions, do research with it, and then contribute to its development. So as you can see, they are topics that a scientist would look at and understand why they're providing certain metadata, because it's going to help with others to understand how to do these 6 things. The ontology is implemented in OWL, and we actually use it as part of our OntoSoft portal that lets the scientists specify metadata for the software and to create a software registry for geosciences. So the metadata categories, as I mentioned, there's 6 of them, and under each of them there's subcategories. I won't go through all of them, and for each of these subcategories we actually have recommended questions and then optional questions. So if the questions are recommended, then they tend to answer them, and if they're optional, they may or may not. So if you're basically trying to publish a very simple script, you may not bother with a lot of the questions. If you're publishing a model or some piece of code that you've developed for a period of months or maybe years, then they're more likely to be more thorough in answering all the questions. And there's a pointer to the ontology up at the top. So we use this ontology to structure the portal for OntoSoft. So I indicate on the bottom left that we use this ontology to guide the questions. So in this case, the major category in the ontology is identify, the subcategory is locating the software, and so important questions have to do with, basically keywords and what's the website of the project and things like that. And so they're kind of questions that are organized to help someone find or make sure that this is the software that they had in mind when they were looking for it. What we do is immediately, if there's a project website that lives on GitHub, for example, we have automatic crawlers that import metadata. So it will pop a question and will say, you know, I found the following information on GitHub. Would you like me to include it here? So so we're complementary and synergistic with these software repositories where we're providing an environment to describe the metadata that helps the scientists describe further metadata than what these repositories require or guide the scientists to provide. Given all these metadata categories from the ontology, we actually have a way for them to filter the software that's there and kind of search for particular kinds of software. So these are a simple search on various categories. So hydrology models that are in C++ and have a new general public license. So so it filters out a few of the software components that are in the repository. And you can see in the middle a little button that says compare. And so when you do that, it actually shows you side by side. This is kind of comparison shopping, right? So there's all these models that are written in C++ and do and are for hydrology, but here's how they compare. So if there's too many of them, then you can narrow down the search and you can look through all of these different metadata categories and see what might matter to you the most. So this kind of interactive comparison of alternatives is important to them. Sometimes they care a lot about having better support. Sometimes they care more about what language it's implemented in. It differs, but they really care a lot about comparing these different things. One thing that we're doing that's very exciting is including metadata standards for geosciences in terms of how the software is applicable to particular geoscience domains and particular geoscience variables. So if you're writing software that, for example, plots water runoff and it takes into account certain basin information, you want to be able to describe that in a way that it helps relate your software to other software. So if you did this visualization, maybe there's a model that generates water runoff, and being able to connect the software based on the kind of variables, physical variables that they handle. So this is work by Scott Peckham from Colorado, and you can see that he's thought very hard about conventions for describing variables in the environment. So I'll give you an example that he uses. So maybe to describe a particular piece of software, you use Streamflow. Another software, we call it Discharge. And he has these conventions where you would talk about a watershed, you would talk about the outlet water, and then you would talk about the rate of the outflow in terms of volume. So he has developed these conventions so that they can be, the description of these variables can be normalized. And they're pretty comprehensive because he's looked at hundreds and hundreds of models, and he's worked with a lot of different domains to create these conventions. He also has physics-based assumptions that the models make. He's doing a terrific amount of work on this. And I think it will be very useful to make the software descriptions that much more useful to the scientists. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about how we're disseminating best practices. This actually has been a very exciting work. So for a lot of geoscientists, you know, they just don't know where to start to share their code. But also there's many geoscientists that are very good at software development. They do these very large computations. They write MPI codes. They have these frameworks where they do model coupling. They have to do regridding. They have very heavy-duty software engineering practices. These codes have been there for many years, maybe decades. So even for them, the dissemination of best practices would be useful. So this is just an example where this is work from Chris Madman at JPL. He ran DRAT, which is a piece of software, Apache software that they've extended to look for software license distribution in large code bases. So you have some large code base. It's basically going to crawl and look for licensing statements and provide a report on what licensing agreements that code base depends on. So they run DRAT on a very popular repository for geosciences called CIG. So they found only some of the codes in only some of the files in the repository were actually codes, and of those, only some of them had actually licensing statements and were stating their license using standard licenses and the normal form of statement of the license. So even for very skillful software developers in geosciences, it would be useful to disseminate these best practices. So what we did is get together with our early career advisory committee and ask them what would it take to disseminate these best practices, and essentially they would say, we would love to learn these best practices, but I don't have time this month, I don't have time this week, and I don't have time this year. It's one of those things where, maybe there's some magical time in the future where I'll actually have the time. So what we discovered is that they would prefer to learn these things while they do research. So we decided to create this environment where they would be trained as they write a paper that they're currently writing. So we would say, you're writing a paper about this, you really want to collect all your software, publish it, make it citable, get credit for it, make your paper reproducible, and attach licenses to your software, so all of those kinds of things. So they found this very attractive. So the pilot that we did, we called it a geoscience paper of the future, if they wrote the paper in this way. And we did a pilot with about 13 participants. You can see their pictures here. And they cover a lot of areas in geosciences. So volcanology, marine biology, polar sciences, cryospheric, climate, hydrology, all kinds of areas. And we asked them, let's spread this out over the spring semester, and this was done in the spring of this year, and let's do 2 to 4 hours a week. So we would get together every other week. We would have a telecon. They would get training for about half an hour or so, and then they would go off for the following 2 weeks and implement that training for their paper. And then at the next telecon, 2 weeks later, they would report on their progress, ask questions, mention problems they had found, mention good things they had discovered. They would share their experiences, and then they would get training for the next thing. So this was very successful. We had these 13 authors. You can see all the areas that they covered here. They came from all over the place. So what a geoscience paper of the future aims to have is all the data and software and provenance of the paper to be well documented. So that means we want the data to be publicly available in a repository, to be documented with metadata, to have a license, and to be citable with a persistent identifier. Same thing for software. And the software should be even, small scripts or any ancillary software, data preparation software that is used. And then the provenance and the methods, we want them to document as much as possible. So if they are able to put it in a shared repository, give it a persistent identifier, that's great, but at least to be able to document the workflow. So the geoscience paper of the future has aspects of what you see in modern papers, that it's not just text, but they also include data sets and supplemental materials and pointers to data repositories. You also see aspects of reproducible publications, including the software and the provenance, but you also see aspects of open science. So we want things to be in shared repositories, to have open licenses, and to be as well described as possible. And finally, to have these best practices from digital scholarship to support credit, so to have citations for data and software, and also persistent identifiers. So based on this pilot, it had very good reception, and we saw a big opportunity with it. We decided to start a Geoscience Paper of the Future initiative and open and broadening the participation to other scientists beyond these 13 participants. So we thought what they had been able to learn could be disseminated further. So this Geoscience Papers of the Future initiative has two aspects to it. One is a special issue of a journal. It's an AGU journal. AGU is the largest society in geosciences. It has, I believe, about 60,000 members. Their annual meeting is in December, and I think they get about 30,000 participants there. And AGU just started a new journal that's open access. It's called Earth and Space Science, and it's pretty general scope. So they're publishing a special issue. They call it a special section on Geoscience Papers of the Future. I'll mention more in a minute. The second part of this initiative is to hold training sessions for geoscientists, and so they're able to learn these best practices and then embark in writing one of these Geoscience Papers of the Future and submit it to this special section of the journal. So let me tell you about each of those in a bit more detail. The special issue is underway. The submissions will close in January next year, so if you have scientists that are working with you and might be interested in this, there's still a lot of time. And we have two major submission categories. One is research articles. So these report on novel research that the scientists are doing, and they're documenting it as a GPF. And the second category, major category, is technical reports. So this would be a paper that says, I published a paper earlier about my thesis 10 years ago, or, some other work that I did before, and the paper is published. This paper is about documenting how I did it and the method, and give more detailed information about the software and the data and everything else. So that would be a technical report. And you can see the editors are geoscientists and myself, but they're geoscientists pursuing this. The second part of the GPF initiative is training sessions. So we're targeting scientists. So we assume that they don't have a programming or computer science background. They still should be able to publish GPFs. We assume a general audience, so these are not training sessions for R or for MATLAB or for Python. They really don't assume any particular platform or environment. We're pretty much generalists. And then we're mindful of the level of effort. So for each of the tasks or the aspects of a GPF, we teach a simple approach, a simple and quick way to make to take best practices and improve papers and make them more open and better published. And then we talk about an ideal approach. So as an example, if you're talking about publishing your data in a repository, we'll recommend a simple approach of putting the data in something like Figshare. It takes minutes. It makes the data available. It's open. You will have attached a license. You'll have a citation for the data. It just takes minutes. So that's a very simple approach. There's no excuse not to do it. The ideal approach would be to learn from your colleagues what is a repository that your community uses and actually go through a curation process so that the data is discoverable and so on and so forth. But that takes an investment and it takes time. It's totally worth doing, but they can do that as they get more interested in improving their practices. Similarly for software, so the simplest approach that we recommend is that they publish their code in Figshare or Zenodo. Alternatively, they can put it on their website, but they should get a permanent, persistent URL, a PURL, and they should have a license and a citation. So those are the simplest possible approaches. Ideally, they would put their code in a shared repository, so GitHub or Bitbucket or any code sharing platform. It takes a while for them to learn. It takes a few days of investment to get that set up, but that's the ideal approach, and when they have time, they can do that. So we're very mindful of the level of effort. And those are the major topics that we teach, and it's basically to make the data and the software accessible and well documented, and then to record the provenance and the methods. So we hold training sessions for scientists. We were just at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on Monday. There's a webinar coming up on September 16, and we're going to be in a variety of places. So if you're interested, I can send you a flyer. You can point people to our website, and it's free, and you just have to RSVP, and you can participate on these sessions. They last about 3 hours. The instructors have become the geoscientists themselves, so they actually come. So, for example, Wally Fulweiler came to Woods Hole. She's an oceanographer, and she had very compelling stories to tell about why she did a GPS for her work and all the benefits. She got in trouble because the senator said that a journalist said that the data that a senator was showing about global warming was wrong, and it was based on some work that she had done, and she had not documented properly. So she had to do a lot of work to unearth things that she did 8 years ago and try to put this senator's name in the right perspective, because what the senator was saying was true, but the journalist was calling on the reproducibility and the practices of how the science was done. So these instructors are terrific. And then we have support for authors as well, for questions and answers that helps them. So let me conclude and leave some time for questions. So we think that the software that geoscientists write is very valuable as a research product. It's best if we can figure out how to embed the best practices of software sharing into their research activities. By reusing software and getting others to help them develop code, you can improve productivity, quality, and reproducibility. All of these are great benefits to scientists. And our particular contributions in the OntoSoft project are this ontology of scientific software, metadata, the portal that we're developing for software registry, and then these training approaches to help scientists learn best practices through writing geoscience papers of the future. In terms of future work, we really have in mind supporting a distributed federation of OntoSoft portals, so that we think that each community needs to be responsible for their own software, and then we want to support aggregation and redistribution across portals, and of course, offer a central EarthCube portal that can aggregate from all of these different installations. And then finally, work more on the recommender system and the community aspects of the project. So we have a lot of ideas on that for the future, but we really want to be proactive in suggesting and pushing software to the geoscientists. And that's the end of the talk. I have pointers to all the things that I mentioned up left, and I want to thank other project members, all the scientists that have participated, people that have given us advice on the project, and NSF and EarthCube for enabling us to embark on this software rescue mission. I'll take questions, Marlon.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? I'll get us started. I'm curious how much, so for obvious reasons of funding opportunities and so forth, you been concentrating on working with the EarthCube community, but how much of this could be applied as is without additional effort to other communities? I mean, besides the effort of doing it, what of this is fundamentally Earth Science centric versus just your target community?
That's a very good question. So I would say none of this is geoscience centric. I think what's geoscience centric is the kind of impetus that the community has to be concerned with these topics. So for example, I mentioned the training this week at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and at WHOI there was a proteomics researcher. So he researches proteomics in marine animals, and so they were there, just wondering how to do a better job with their proteomic analysis. So none of this is specific to geosciences. And if you think about it, geosciences is such a broad discipline, right? You have the geophysics, you have the people that do field science. It's very diverse. So we've been very mindful to keep it very, very general purpose. I would say the difference is that Geosciences has this impetus now through EarthCube to do a better job at knowledge management and sharing.
Other questions?
Hi, this is Gary Gorbit. I have a question. You seem to have sort of emphasized scientists who are not necessarily very knowledgeable about computer scientists. What about, kind of from the other point of view, computer scientists or engineers, software engineers that work with scientists? Have you kind of come at this project from that point of view, or what software engineers need to emphasize to get their software into the system, in a sense, and connected to scientific papers and so on?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. So, and it's a tough one. So the UK Software Institute has been very focused on that kind of researchers. So computer scientists and software developers that participate in science projects. And our emphasis and our focus has not been on them. So for example, they would have no trouble understanding and using something like GitHub or a code sharing site. This would be, second nature to them. For scientists, that's a barrier. That's a big barrier. So we're just working with them and understanding what is it that makes it hard. So we're just focused on a different population, and I think what the group that you're talking about is very important, and the UK Science Institute is very focused on them. I think we're looking at this from the scientist perspective, but we have to have a whole ecosystem of software. So I mentioned at the beginning, we also don't talk about cyber infrastructure software, and I know there's also a lot of groups very concerned, in particular in NSF, the software sustainability program. So I think we need to worry more about this ecosystem of different contributors to software environments for scientists. We've just been focused on the scientists themselves. There's also the ecosystem of commercial scientific software. So we need to eventually work together, but I think we've just been focused on a particular constituency of that ecosystem.
Understand. Thank you.
Hey, Yolanda, this is Don at NCAR. A really nice talk.
Hi, Don. Thanks.
Yeah, it was fascinating. I noticed you have an event at NCAR on September 28th.
Yes,
Who's coming out to teach? And I don't recall seeing any announcements for that. So have you signed up people to attend already?
So the announcements should come out early next week. And okay. I'm going to be there, and also Alan Pope, who is a cryospheric researcher, will be there.
Cool.
So he's one of the GPF authors. So, yeah, it will be fun.
So this is in conjunction with the WISPY workshop?
It's accidentally on the same day.
Oh. Okay.
Completely accidentally. I'll be at a climate informatics workshop the Friday before, so it just worked out that way.
Yeah, let me get in a plug then also. The Gateway Computing Environments workshop that Nancy and others organizing is also in Boulder, immediately following WISPY. So Yolanda and anybody else, if you happen to be in Boulder, hang out the rest of the week.
Great.
Or a couple more days if you can.
Great.
Busy week.
Yeah, I have to teach.
Thanks, Yolanda.
Any other questions?
This is Stu Martin from University of Chicago and Globus. I had a question. So I know Exceed's done like software catalog of the software that's available on Exceed to make it so people can know what's there and find it. I'm wondering what might be the interaction or relationship between, like, you know, a certain version installed on Exceed, and does it make sense that they would want to like link back to some software in your system, or as somebody has grabbed software and compiled and know it's runnable on a machine, that kind of interacts with your software cataloging?
This is an excellent question. So one of the things that we are trying to impart to the scientists is that keeping track of versions is very important. And if there's an important enough version that they're deploying it on something like Exceed, it should have a persistent and unique identifier. People should know what version it is and be able to track it down back to the original code and how you've published it and if there's updates and so on. So this is something that we haven't focused on very much, but I think your question suggests that it will be important for us to work with groups like Exceed to make this connection between the publication of the software and the registry, the software registry, and the deployment of the software in these shared execution environments. So we'd be very interested in collaborating with you on this, but it's a very valid point. I agree with you.
This is Marlon again. To follow on to Stu's question, the thing that was occurring to me is that I would say most of the successful gateways are purposefully only going to be a subset of the entire workflow, that in the loosest sense of that term, of what somebody wants to do in their research and how they acquire all the raw material for the paper they're going to write. So it seems like there's a good complementary opportunity between what you're doing and what a lot of gateways do to kind of, for example, recommend to somebody, hey, you're using RaxML or Gaussian. Here's some other tools that they're not in the gateway, or some other helper applications not in the gateway that would be useful for you. Just as an example. Yes,
that would make a lot of sense. Yeah, I would love to collaborate with the Gateway projects on this. I think you know, often we do projects picking on a particular aspect or topic, and I think all of your questions are well taken, that there needs to be a more comprehensive view on the life cycle of all of this scientific software, from design to implementation, prototyping to releases, to deployment, to reuse by others. And so I think, you know, each project by nature focuses on a particular aspect, but we need to have mechanisms that allow us to be more integrative across the project. I agree.
Other questions? One last question.
Hi, this is Gary from UT Health Science Center again. When you were talking about, for example, with Exceed and having some sort of linkage to versions and so on, it occurred to me that in our case, our software is continually changing, And we do have a way of showing the version that's currently being run on Exceed. But if you reference software or links software to a paper, how do you sort of point to the software at the time of the publishing and the fact that that software is continually evolving and you're getting later versions, or is that not really?
This is an issue. So I can say that you're absolutely right. You publish a version of the software, and then the software keeps evolving, and there can be potentially many versions if you start to fix bugs and extend it in various ways and so on. So the best practice that we recommend is that you assign a persistent, unique identifier to any version that is significant that you're releasing. So you may end up with a lot of, DOIs or pearls if you are releasing a lot of versions in a short time, and that's just the way it is. I can also say that, these are kind of new territories and new topics because, for example, for dynamic data, the issue is very similar, very analogous, and we're only now beginning to see some recommendations and some best practices come out of organizations. So, for example, RDA, the Research Data Alliance, just released in June a document with recommendations for data providers to deal with dynamic data. So there's no recommendations yet for data users. Just for data providers, with data sets that kind of grow over time, or maybe you may clean it and, improve them over time. So these are areas where this, the best practices in terms of digital publication and handling research products are very, still very green. So hopefully we'll have improved recommendations in the future. But, people in library sciences have been dealing with these issues for a long time, and they're just having to rethink a lot of them in the view of digital publications. But so anyway, what I want to say is that dynamic data is hard, and software is even harder because it's even more dynamic. So I agree with your point, and we're just doing the best we can with our recommendations for the moment.
Thank you.
All right. Let's thank Yolanda for a nice presentation and good question and answer session at the end. Yolanda, you'll need to stop sharing so I can stop the recording.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.